Good afternoon. I want to welcome everybody to our membership meeting today. This is definitely one of our most popular meetings, having Patrick Jankowski talk about the state of the economy. And boy, especially what's going on now after the freezers, there's no telling what Patrick's going to share with us today. And Patrick, I want to thank you for joining us and committing your time, because I know you're an awful busy person. So thank you for that. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and let Dan Seal make the introduction of Patrick, because Dan and Patrick go back about 31 years, I guess. So Dan, why don't you make the introduction?
Well, thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dan Seal, Executive Director of Economic Development here at the Bay Area Houston Economic Partnership. And I'm thrilled today to be able to introduce our featured speaker, backed by popular demand, Patrick Jankowski. And just think back, it was almost exactly 1 year ago on March 2nd, 2020, and we were all just finishing a nice lunch at the Hilton Hotel down the street. And we were getting ready to hear Patrick's economic outlook for 2020. Remember? There was a little different feel in the air that day as Patrick began to describe some of the possible ramifications of this new COVID disease that was beginning to be in the news around the country. I remember then that we were all still hopeful that maybe things wouldn't really turn out so bad. And then 1 week later, on March 11, the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo got canceled right in the middle of its run. And I think that was when everything really started to hit home for us here in Houston. We took a collective gulp, we swallowed hard, and we thought, uh-oh, this may be trouble. Confusion set in, lots of uncertainty, talks of lockdowns ran rampant, and everyone was debating the value of wearing masks. Just think back on how unsettling things were. Well, here we are, 1 year later. We got through all that, and yet there is still so much uncertainty. I do think things are starting to feel better now with the new infection numbers dropping and the vaccination levels continuing to rise, but I can't imagine having to do Patrick Jankowski's job. I mean, he's always looking in a crystal ball, to some degree. But this year had to be one of the most challenging years ever for any economist to try to figure things out. Well, have no fear, because we have the best prognosticator of them all with us today, Patrick Jankowski. He's been at this now for 38 years and is literally the go-to expert on Houston's economy as the leader of the Greater Houston Partnership's Research Department. If anyone can help us figure out this maze of confusion, it's Patrick. He's one of the smartest people I know, and I'm honored to call him a good friend. So please join me in welcoming to our virtual stage this afternoon, Patrick Jankowski, as he will begin to help us shed some light on where are we going from here. So with that, Patrick, we'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Dan. Yeah, I was thinking about it. It was a year ago. I remember it was just a beautiful sunny day. I went there and I didn't want to go back to the office. I backed to my truck. I looked at all the boats or the yachts that were parked there. God, it was just such a wonderful day and environment, and all the warmth in the room. And I'm trying to remember whether it was cheesecake or pecan pie I had. I mean, it was just really great. And then you're right. Almost 365 days later, look at where we are. So let me go ahead. I'm going to share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. So I need to know, can you guys see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. I always want to make sure that I don't start talking and there's nothing on the screen. So let me go ahead and we're going to get started. Dan, I was smiling when you were introducing me, because you and I were thinking along the same lines as how things were a year ago and how they are now. And this was the front page of the Chronicle on February 23rd. And you could see, above the headline or the banner, "Yee-haw, it's rodeo time." We were all getting excited about the rodeo. And it's interesting, Bernie Sanders had a major victory in Nevada. He was in a real strong contender for the Democrat nomination. And the front page story was maybe something that we developed here can help us thwart the virus. So, things looked a lot different this time last year. And then let's go ahead and look at the headline earlier this week, and that's what it says. We went from hoping that we could contain it to in a year having over 500,000 deaths. 40,000 of those in Texas alone. This has been a fundamental, just a monumental health crisis, collapse of the economy, social issue. It's just really upended the way we think about a lot of things. So give you some idea of where we are. This is data as of the 23rd. The US, we've had 28.2 million cases, and you can see that over 500,000 deaths. You can look at, though, the number of cases on February 22nd for this data, just under 60,000. And that's actually, you can tell from the right-hand side, far right-hand column, that it's been trending down. And that's, as you touched upon it, Dan, we are starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel because things are trending down and deaths are trending down and hospitalizations are trending down as well. And you can see it here on this chart, this graph. I'll let you know, this is something, one of the best sources. I don't know how you might feel about New York, but the New York Times is actually a pretty good source for information. And they have an extensive coronavirus coverage. And this is a chart I pulled from them. And you can see they've been plotting it on a daily basis. And it looks like the peak for COVID cases in the US was January 8th. 300,000 new cases. And it's interesting, if you think of January 8th, that's really about 2 weeks after Christmas Day. So as Anthony Fauci and the other health officials warned us about social gatherings during the holidays, you can see, there's evidence that those social gatherings during the holidays did result in a higher caseload. But as we all went back to work, we all went back to our houses, you can definitely see the trend downwards on that line there. And February 22nd, we were down to the 59,000 cases. You can see cases fell off from the peak to where we are now, almost by about 80%. We went from 300,000 to 60,000. And one thing, Dan and I were talking a little bit before everybody was let into the meeting room about, I went and looked at a data point or two just before I made the presentation. It came online. And if you look right here at the very edge, you can see it's just starting to flatten out right there. And when I went and looked at the live data points, it looks like the rate of decline is kind of flattened somewhat. We're definitely better off than we were a month ago, but there's some concern that that rate of decline is slowing. And you can see that we are not, we're actually, I remember when we had the surge in the summer and we thought that was horrible. Now we've had this decline in recent weeks, but that decline, we're still above where we were in the summer. So kind of think about this in terms of Metro Houston. And when I refer to Metro Houston, I'm referring to the 9-county area. And that's going to be Austin and Brazoria, Chambers and Fort Bend, and Galveston, Harris, Liberty, Montgomery, Waller counties. So we've had over 500,000 cases of the coronavirus in the region, and around 6,800 deaths in the region. So another way to look at that is 1 in every 13 residents in the metro area has come down with the coronavirus, and 1 in roughly every 1,000 residents has died of it. So if you want to kind of break that out by county, you can see it here. See the counties on the left, you can see the number of cases, and how that breaks out is 1 in 17 for Austin County. I don't know why Galveston County has one of the highest infection rates. I need to do a little bit more research on that. 1 in 10 people in Galveston County has come down with it. You can look at the number of deaths on the far right-hand side. Just about every county is 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 11, 1,200. Harris, though, has actually suffered fairly poorly, in Liberty County fairly poorly for the number of deaths. So it kind of puts it in perspective. This coronavirus, this COVID-19, it's impacted everybody. It's impacted every county, every city, every neighborhood, I have a neighbor across the street that I used to wave to when he'd go on his walks. He got COVID and passed away. And early on in the pandemic, it was something that you saw in the news. And now this deep into the pandemic, I think everybody probably knows one person or two persons who's passed away from it. So what we're trying to do is reach herd immunity. And that's essential. That's what we're trying to get, is that herd immunity where the virus can no longer spread to the population. And once we hit that point, that's when we're going to start to see the economy really open up. Right now, we're still practicing social distancing. We're still wearing our masks. A lot of people are still reluctant to go out to the restaurants. So what we really need to see is that herd immunity. And there are a couple ways you get there. One of it's going to depend upon how quickly we can roll out the vaccine. That's probably the most important factor to us getting herd immunity. The other is how long that immunity lasts. Discussions out there is this may be something like a flu shot that you need to get on a regular basis. Or I'm trying to remember, was it the polio vaccine that you got that you had to get a booster, or was it, I know tetanus you have to get one, but we may end up needing to get boosters on something like this. There's a concern about the rise in new variants and whether the vaccines that we're getting now are going to be adequate protection against those variants. And then there's also going to be the effect is, as I said, the current vaccines on the new strains. So this is a chart that I pulled off the internet. And this is kind of the current path to herd immunity. And this is based on the current pace of giving out 1.7 million shots per day on average. And it's put together by the FICOR model. It's a group of data scientists on the East Coast. And herd immunity consists of both getting the vaccination and those who have come down with the virus and have some sort of active antibodies. And looking at this, the way they're saying is depending upon how it plays out, we'll hit herd immunity either sometime between July or November. And the sad thing is, even though we have herd immunity, you're still going to see over 100,000 people die between now and when we get to herd immunity. We could see 200,000 people die. So this is the path or the pace that at the current rate of vaccines and the current rate of infections, we might hit herd immunity sometime in mid to late summer. If we could double that up to 3 million shots per day, that herd immunity, we reach it a little bit closer between May and July, definitely by midsummer. You're still going to see a significant number of people dying, but it moves up that point to where the vaccine doesn't have a chance to spread because there are not enough hosts to welcome it in, host bodies. And if we could even bump it up to 5 million shots per day, we'd reach herd immunity even sooner. This is just a model. I don't think is realistic for us to get to 5 million shots per day. We're having a hard enough time rolling out 1.7 million shots per day. The good thing is you hear Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and all the other vaccine manufacturers are upping their production, so the doses will be available. The challenge is going to be how we distribute them. What I'm hoping, and I think one of the best ways to get this done is we continue to push more vaccine out to the pharmacies, the CVS and Walgreens and Kroger, HEB, Randall's. And so you can get the vaccines wider spread out so not everybody has to get in their car, drive to NRG, wait in line for 2 hours to get their shot. That's a very inefficient way to do it. And if we could disperse it, I think we have a chance of getting herd immunity quicker than if it continues to be distributed through one of those mega centers. So, I'm sorry, I clicked the wrong button. There you go. So even if we get herd immunity, we still have the issue of what's happening outside the US. Now, I'm fairly confident we're going to hit herd immunity midsummer, late midsummer. My concern is what's going to happen outside the US. Europe has been slow to ramp up its vaccine program. China seems to have done okay, but you're seeing a little bit of backsliding in some of the Asian countries. Very little happening in the emerging markets. And so although the US may reach herd immunity this year, we probably won't hit herd immunity globally until next year or the year after that. And that's going to have a bit of a weight on the economy, a bit of a weight on, especially on Houston, since so much of what we do is tied to global trade. But at some point, we will reach that tipping point. Now, I've talked about this in other presentations. is at some point we will have herd immunity. And at that point that we have herd immunity, there's going to be a lot of pent up demand released. Everyone is tired of sitting at home. I know I'm tired of sitting at home. God, I hate to say this. Don't tell my bosses I'm looking forward to commuting into work, getting into downtown and seeing my coworkers and going out to eat. My wife and I are already talking about, gosh, is there going to be any chance to take a cruise this summer? Will we reach herd immunity by then? So there's going to be pent up demand release, and that's going to add some juice to the economy. And that's really when you're going to see growth pick up and take off. But until then, growth is going to be kind of lukewarm. And it's not there isn't going to be any growth, but it's not going to be the sort of growth that we really need. Because if you look at it, we have only recouped about 55, 56% of the jobs that we lost. In the pandemic, in March and April, in 2 months, we lost 22.1 million jobs. God, think about that, 22.1 million jobs. That's phenomenal. And we've gotten back a little over 12 million, but they're still just shy of 10 million jobs short. So there are still a lot of people out there who aren't working, who are dependent upon the stimulus checks or handouts from their brother-in-law or are drawing down savings or something. Now, the good thing is there are some employment forecasts out there that are projecting very strong growth for the US in 2021. You can see IHS Markit is 6.7 million jobs, Oxford Economics 5.8, the Wall Street Journal 4.8. Excuse me one second, I need a sip of Earl Grey because my vocal cords are getting a little dry. Yes, it is Earl Grey. It's not something from the Richmond Arms. So if you look at that, now that's extremely strong growth. I need to let you know, I'm not quite as, I haven't fully bought into this. I haven't fully embraced it. As I've read this, what a lot of economists are saying is that this downturn was different. The Great Recession was caused by a financial collapse, and it always takes longer to recover from a financial collapse. This recession was caused by a government mandate. You shall stay home. You shall not open up your bar. People will, and employers sending their employees home to avoid them getting sick. What I don't think, well, let me back up. I think what we're seeing is that classic line that generals are still fighting the last war. And I think that's what's happening with a lot of people out there in the economics community is they're looking at past recessions and projecting based on that. I see things a little different. I think we have seen some structural changes in the economy. And I think things have been sped up. And a lot of the jobs and a lot of the activities that we expect to come back either won't come back or they'll come back in a different form. I mean, the classic one is retail. And we knew retail has been struggling all along, but with the pandemic and the ability to deliver, to buy things online and have it delivered to your house. So some of those retail jobs are never coming back. If you think about it, this concept is that there's a discussion that when people go back to the office, it'll probably always be a hybrid environment. Rather than working 5 days a week in the office, you may work 2 days or 3 days a week. Well, think of all those restaurants or businesses which depend upon a lunchtime crowd. That's not going to come back. My truck, prior to the pandemic, I was putting 18,000 miles a year on my truck. Last year, I put 3,000. Okay, so when I start driving back to work, it'll be somewhere between 3 and 18. But if I put half as many miles on my truck, it's going to last a lot longer. So what we don't really understand is the structural changes or how much the behaviors which we adopted to survive the pandemic are going to be permanent. So I think we're going to have strong growth. I'm very skeptical of 6.7 million jobs. I'm a little skeptical of 4.8 million, and I could be wrong, but I still think that we're looking too much at the way we came out of past recessions and projecting based on that and not realizing there's some structure. Think about the movie theaters. Think about the movie studios. They're releasing it now on the internet and in the theaters. Why are people going to even go to the theater? There'll be much fewer theaters. And we lost 2,000 theater jobs during the pandemic. Well, I need to go on. So you can see that's what it looks like monthly, the job growth. You know, when we were in the strongest part, or the last year, the longest expansion in US history, we were adding jobs at the rate of 200,000 a month. And so that's the reason why, another reason why I'm skeptical. Can maybe we double that? That gets us up to the Wall Street panel's forecast. It doesn't get us up to the IHS market forecast. So, you know, if we hit even the middle part of that forecast, if we hit this Oxford economics forecast, we would have recouped a little over 18 million jobs. That'll still leave us with 4 million jobs short of where we were prior to the pandemic. So what I'm saying is it will take us at least 2 years, if not more, from the start of the pandemic to recover all the jobs we've lost. GDP will recover long before that, but the jobs will take longer. And another concern, we're still seeing a high number of initial claims for unemployment insurance. I heard on the news that they came in under 800,000 this week, which is in the right direction, but that's still almost 2 to 3 times higher than they should be. So, you know, what are the drivers that's going to help support this job growth? And part is the fiscal stimulus package that Congress is debating right now. We may get an infrastructure package, and that would be very good for Houston since our construction industry is struggling. Record low interest rates. I refinanced my house a month ago. I'm sure glad I did. The success of the vaccine rollout and the pent-up demand I talked about earlier. So really what we need to do, we need to keep our fingers crossed that the vaccine rollout is successful, that we get herd immunity sometime mid-year, and that pent-up demand is released. So let's shift to the other topic that I know that you guys want to hear about. That's the impact of last week's freeze. Last week's freeze on Houston, on the economy. And, I was just thinking this time last week, I was sitting in a cold, dark house. So things have definitely changed in the week. You know, we had icy conditions everywhere. And so what's the impact of those icy conditions? Well, first, let me talk to you about just how bad it got. And this is something I pulled from the National Weather Service. A lot of data there, but I want to tell you the first thing is I actually found this chart that I literally cut and pasted from the web quite amusing, because what the chart is trying to illustrate is just how bad burned coal it got. And on the right-hand side, there's a picture of the downtown skyline with nice sunlight and green trees, a beautiful spring day. So I guess that's kind of a contradictory picture of what they're trying to put up. Maybe it was the person who put this together, it was their little joke. But I want you to go and look here, and what you're looking at is on February 15th of last week, it got down to 16 degrees in the city of Houston. That was the lowest temperature it got. Previously, the lowest recorded temperature was 18 degrees, and that was in 1905. The temperature only got up to 25 degrees that day. So that was the maximum. And prior to that, the lowest maximum on that day was 32 degrees. So you can read that across again. 13 on the 16th. You can look there. Ties the record in 1895. The high was 35 on that day. So previously, the lowest high was 36. It kind of illustrates that. I want to show you one other chart, and this looks really confusing. It looks like someone's testing paint on the wall. You know, honey, what do you think of this color? No, what do you with a roller? So, but I want you to look at that green band in the middle. That green band in the middle is a normal temperature range in February for each of those days. That kind of peach or peachish color at the top, and you can see each one of those numbers, that is the record high on those days. And that nice pastel color on the bottom, that's the record low. And so you can look through this, and if you look at these blue bars or these blue columns, this is what the temperature range was on that day this month. And you could see we were pretty much in a normal temperature range until the cold snap hit. And you could see how many days we were well below the normal temperature range. And then you see these 2 record days, and you see it go across. So you can look and see we were below, our low was in the below normal range for just a real long 9-10 days. And it gives you some idea. You could just see how severe this cold snap was, this freeze was, compared to historic norms. And so that's definitely had an impact on the economy. And I've been getting lots of questions. What's the economic impact? Well, let me start with this. There's this number that's floating out there, $50 billion. And this is a number that has been picked up by the national media, local media. I've heard it on NPR. I've heard it on one of the local affiliates. I need to let you know this number is not being used properly. Let me explain to you why. This is something that was put together by AccuWeather. They've got an economist there who models it. And you can see from the statement, excuse me, I'm sorry, from their press release, you can see that this is the economic impact they were looking at from coast to coast. So yeah, I think a lot of it was focused in Texas. We got the attention because of the collapse in our power grid, but this wasn't just a Texas storm. This was in the Midwest and part of the West. Get some idea of just how severe it was, and it wasn't just Texas. Union Pacific had to shut down most of their intermodal network because of the storm that was raging in the Midwest and in the West. Now, the damage, that $50 billion, or you see here, they've kind of couched their bets, it was actually 45 to 50 billion. And that's both not just damage, but that's the economic loss. And you read a little bit further into their press release, and these are all the factors they are considering. It's the damage to homes and businesses, it's the losses from jobs and wages, it's damage to infrastructure, it's business losses from businesses which didn't open up, medical expenses associated with the freeze, the cost of power outages to individuals, economic losses because the highways were closed and we couldn't get freight in or out, government. So it's the whole kit and caboodle of cost, of impact. So be real careful if someone says, I hear there's $50 billion worth of damage in Houston. Well, that's very wrong.
It hadn't been accurate for 3 years.
The $50 billion in damage for Texas, that's wrong. It's 50 billion in total loss all across. So this is kind of a back of the envelope calculation. It's a little bit sloppy. I don't really like to do this, but just to kind of put it in perspective, if it's a given that nothing happened last week, there was no commerce took place for a full week, and we have a $512 billion economy, there's 52 weeks in a year. Now it gives you basically an impact of $1 billion in lost GDP. Now that's kind of that economic activity measure. But the problem with that is there's a lot of pent up demand after the storm, and things which weren't purchased last week or transactions which didn't take place last week have been pushed into this week or pushed later into the spring. Those workers who weren't able to work last week, they're going to have to probably work some overtime this week or future weeks to meet the orders that they couldn't meet last week. And guys like me who were at home, even though I wasn't able to work, I was more worried about my water and more worried about my electricity than I was, frankly, worried about the economy. Start to put in some late evenings to get caught up. So I really want to emphasize this was not a $50 billion event for Houston. If anybody tells you that, you need to correct them. And this was definitely not comparable to Hurricane Harvey. And I've had people already use that number, that this is comparable to Hurricane Harvey, or this is approaching Hurricane Harvey. In Hurricane Harvey, in the Houston region, we had 100,000 homes that were damaged and made unlivable. I'm not hearing those sort of reports in the media or the people I talk to. We lost 300,000 vehicles in Hurricane Harvey. I haven't heard of anybody having lost a vehicle, although I know there are probably some. There are probably some collisions or maybe some cracked engine blocks because of inadequate antifreeze. But this is no way approach a Hurricane Harvey sort of event. The only way I would compare this to Hurricane Harvey would be this past week was an extremely emotional event. It was because people were cold and in the dark and worried about food and water. And so it was very stressful the way Harvey was very stressful. So there is a psychological cost to last week, but the financial cost comes nowhere similar. So let's get back to the storm's impact on Metro Houston. I need to let you know that's a real head scratcher trying to come up with this. The thing I just told you last week, I was sitting in the dark, and here a week later, I'm trying to come up with the economic impact of the storm. And one of the challenges is the data that's available is limited. And we have a number of different models at the partnership that we run, models for economic impacts or corporate relocations, or models for tax benefits to the city if business relocates, or models for forecasting job growth. But we don't have models that says what happens when you have an ice storm hit the region. And also, it's too soon to assess because we're still figuring out just exactly what happened last week. But one thing which is fairly certain, that is the impact fell heaviest last week on those who could least afford it. And what I'm talking about are the hourly workers, those who punch a time clock or sign a time card, because they couldn't show up to work. They were at home. They weren't able to bag groceries. They weren't able to run a lathe. They weren't able to pound a hammer. They weren't able to collect a paycheck. Now, it's roughly 60% of all workers in the US. You apply that to Houston, that rough percentage, and that's 1.8 million workers in Houston are hourly workers who did not collect a paycheck last week. And I did a little math. I went into one of the databases we have and tried to figure out, I tried to pick occupations that are most likely in a industry that is out where they would be paid hourly. And I actually came up to about 1.75 million Houstonians. So that's pretty close to that 1.8, that 59%. And I did a weighted average of how much they were making, and they were making about $14 an hour. I bring that up, and there's also another category out there, and those of you who've worked with United Way may be familiar with this. And that's something called the ALICE worker, and that's the asset limited, income constrained, but employed. And that's the working poor, those who are making just enough to get by. They scrape by with every penny. And there's 700,000 households in Houston where either one or two of the people that live in there are ALICE workers, or it's an ALICE household. So either way you look at it, 1.8 million workers or 700,000 households in Houston were without a paycheck last week. So you're going to just do some real simple math. $14 an hour times a 40-hour week equals a $560 paycheck. I imagine for many of those, that's a month's worth of groceries, or that's their car payment plus their insurance payment, or 50% of their rent. So think about it, those hourly workers are the ones that were the most severely impacted, the ones that can least afford it. And that's the reason why we're still seeing scenes like this, and we will probably see scenes like this for a while. First, it was because of COVID, and now it's because of the big freeze last week because of the winter storm, of people needing to get in line because they don't have enough to eat and they don't have potable water to drink. So salaried professionals like myself, a little different. I was able to work at home, or at least I was able to work at home part of Monday until I lost my power. And then, this is on the left-hand side, you see how we're working COVID. This is how we worked last week, at least last week until we lost power. I did have one person tell me that they had a neighbor whose boss told them, you continue to work on your laptop until the power goes out. Trying to get the last bit of blood from the turnip. That's kind of a mixed metaphor there. But, and so I bring that up because, as salaried professionals, there were no Zoom meetings with coworkers last week. There were no client meetings. There was no project work, no billable hours. I was hoping I might be able to do some catch-up work. Couldn't get that done. But in spite of that, most salaried professionals still got paid last week, even though they weren't able to work. No work got done. Of course, I'm working some pretty long evenings now, trying to make up for last week, and I think most professionals are. Which gets back to that point about it's not a full 1 week lost GDP. But those who are salaried professionals have not had the same level of impact as others did. The impact comes in things like this, the impact on household finances, the busted pipes. I went to Home Advisor and gosh, I can't imagine the plumber's only charging $45 an hour, but that's what they had listed there. I think it's probably more like $175 an hour. And the sheetrock damage that results from the busted pipes. And if you're out of power, probably everything in your refrigerator went bad and had to be thrown away. And I went out after everything was over with, pulled off the tarps and the bed sheets and the blankets, and every plant that I covered froze. And so I lost all my landscaping. So there's that when things warm up will have to be replaced. So there is financial losses there. Not like having your house swept away in Harvey or pushed sideways off the foundation. And there's ways to pay for that. There's insurance, but you still have your deductible. People are going to have to pull money from their savings to cover some of these costs. You might see some early 401k withdrawals. People are going to add it to the credit cards. They'll forego purchases they had planned. The point is, anybody who had damage is worse off because they've either had to pay out of pocket, pull down savings. Their net worth is lower now than it was prior to the storm. Even if their net worth is only lower by $1,000 or $2,000, it is lower. And you can multiply that times all the houses that had damage in the region. Now, there's some sectors that are always impacted by weather events. People don't go out to restaurants. They didn't go out to a restaurant last week, and the restaurants themselves couldn't open. The workers couldn't get there. They didn't have water. They didn't have power. They didn't have gas. A lot of flights were canceled at the airports. Small business owners couldn't meet with their clients. The retail stores were closed. Theaters were closed. So there was this activity which didn't take place. But as I was researching that, I came across this quote by Mark Zandi. He said, "You can't shut down what's already shut down." And he was referring to the fact that all these activities that you see on this slide had already been very severely reduced by COVID. And it's just one more straw. It's one more event. It's one more challenge that they have to face. But as far as a measure of lost activity, it wouldn't be as strong as if this had happened when the economy was booming. So they were already struggling. So the impact is not quite as great. Now you think about the loss of electricity, natural gas, water. It was misery for us at home, but we lost production at some of the refineries and the chemical plants, the food processing operations. I went to S&P Global, and there were some stories there about they had called and were surveying around and found these are examples of plants in the Houston region that had some sort of issue that they had to deal with, either a shutdown or flaring or a reduced run. But it definitely impacted our petrochemical industry here in Houston and refining. You can go to the far right-hand side and you can see the Gulf Coast refineries only operated about 62, 63% of their capacity. Now, this had been creeping up since, in the worst part of the COVID pandemic, we only got down to about 66% of capacity on the Gulf Coast. So our refining capacity actually dropped lower than it did back in March and April. But you can see we lost about 24, 25% of our refining capacity. We were running even much lower as a result of that. Part of that was feedstock. Part of it was workers not even be able to get to the plant. We had issues, the hospitals, complicated patient care. There's anecdotes out there of hospitals without water, having to bring in bottled water to meet with their needs. Hotels, and some hotels did well. Guests checked in because they had no power and water at home. Some hotels had to let all their guests go, move them to another hotel because they lost power and they couldn't take care of their guests. Grocers, if your power was off, grocers have backup generators and batteries, but they don't have enough to last for a week. I've gone into stores in my neighborhood. I live out in the energy corridor, and everything's spoiled, and the entire freezer case was empty. The entire meat case was empty. And the entire dairy case was empty because everything's spoiled and had to be thrown out. And the winter storms, I get back to, yes, the focal point was Texas, and everyone's looking at us because of the problems of the power grid, but it affected supply chains all across the US because of stuff which comes in and out of the port, comes in and out of Texas. stuff that we need in Texas to do our business, or stuff we make here and ship out. And these are two charts that I found on a website that actually tracks truck movement. And you look at the one on the right-hand side, and you can see where it drops below zero. That is inbound truck traffic to Texas. It was off by almost 47% on February 17th. Outbound truck traffic was off 47% on February 18th. And the amount of time that they were spending when they got here was creeping up. So you can see, though, it's gotten better, but there was just no freight moving anywhere in the southern part of the U.S. And that has, if you read, FedEx in Memphis was having problems as well. So we had supply chain disruptions. But you also need to think about the long-term impacts. We'd always, I'm a native Texan. I remember the stories of Davy Crockett at the Battle of the Alamo and all that sort of stuff that we were taught, and this fierce sense of pride we've had, and this Texas exceptionalism. And now we're being taken task for that. We'd said that because Texas had such a wonderful business climate and we had low regulation and so forth, that we were exceptional. And that's the reason why our economy has grown so strong. And now nationally, we're being challenged for that. And this other long-term impact is we need to figure out what we can do to fix the infrastructure, because we keep on hearing people say never again. Now, I bring that up. It's out there in the media, guys, now. Washington Post, which you may think has a fairly liberal slant, but Bloomberg, which is a pro-business, it's a business publication. Both of them are taking us to challenge for this. So we're going to have a little bit of image repair that we're going to need to do. It's also this long-term issue. The power outages aren't just a result of the cold. Read that subhead. The electrical infrastructure plays a big role. We have to figure out how to fix the infrastructure. And we have to plan for it better next time, as you see what the Atlantic says. So that's kind of the impact. I wish I could give you a number. I can tell you $50 billion is wrong. I'm just going to say, this morning I went on and found an article where someone said it was $125 billion impact on the state of Texas. People are just pulling numbers here and there. I can't give you an exact number, but hopefully what I've done is giving you some idea of the way industry was impacted. And it's not really a mosaic. To give you a picture, maybe it's more like a collage. Maybe it's more like a mixed media collage at that. But it does give you some idea of just how the economy was impacted by the storm. So last slide on this before I shift to talking a little bit about the economy in general in Houston. May 31st, you wonder why I have that circled. That's the last day of the legislative session this year. Remember, we meet every other year for 140 days in Austin. We have 95 days left in this legislative session. I don't see how we're going to get anything fixed in 95 days. There are hearings. Hearings are going on now. There'll be blue ribbon committees. Things will be proposed. I'm trying to figure out what legislation can get written and the hearings and proposed and done. I'm not a policy person. I'm an economist, but I'm just thinking this is something that's going to take more than one session to get resolved, maybe in a special session. But it's going to be a long time before we finally get everything fixed, but we have to get it fixed. So let's shift. Let's talk a little bit about the COVID recession and the impact on the region, the 9-county region. Well, once again, we saw unemployment in the region off the charts. We saw so many job losses. In this region, in Houston, we lost 350,000 jobs in March and in April. Think about that. In 2 months, we lost the equivalent to probably 5 years job growth. Absolutely phenomenal. If you want to see how that looks, Dan and I were talking about this. Dan introduced me. I've been at the partnership for longer than, the only thing that I'll say is I've been at the partnership for a long time. The only place I've been longer than that is I've been married 1 year longer than I've been at the partnership. So, but if you can look at this, you can see the recession that we just went through was worse than the 80s oil bust. That's what I was trying to get at. If you go back to the 80s, we thought that was a horrible recession. The Great Recession was actually fairly mild compared to this. But take it one step further. the COVID recession that we just went through, that we're coming out of, was worse than the two previous worst recessions combined. So we dug an awful deep hole. And that's one of those reasons why I'm not as enthusiastic that we're going to be able to get out of this fairly quickly, because we've got a real deep hole to get out of. Now, we've done fairly well. We've got these 350 of the 350,000 jobs we lost. We've added back 214,000. That leaves 135,000 to be recouped. But all the easy jobs we've gotten back so far. The next third is going to be much more difficult. Now you can see we're still missing roughly 40% of what we've got. We're recouped about 61, 62%. But we're not adding jobs at the rate to really very quickly get that extra, you can see right here, that 135. We're not really adding them at the rate to knock a big hole in that 135. You can see there are areas that are still struggling, restaurants and bars. A lot of restaurants have closed and may never open again. So there's no place for the wait staff or the restaurant workers to go back to work. Construction's winding down because we've overbuilt in office and overbuilt in industrial and overbuilt in multifamily. Wholesale trade and manufacturing are so closely tied to oil and gas in this town, and that's struggling. But we have some areas that have made some progress: finance, insurance, professional services, retail, trade, and transportation, utilities. They're all fully recovered. You can see the ones struggling on the right. But I need to let you know, retail and transportation, those have asterisks by them because they have only recovered because of the surge in hiring we see every October and November as merchants take on additional help for the holiday season, and transportation companies like DHL and FedEx and UPS bring on extra workers for package delivery. When we see the January, you're going to see some job losses, and I'll get to that in a moment. So if you want to look at this as data, which is compiled by Opportunity Insights Electronic Tracker, it's a group out of MIT and Harvard. They're looking at where the job growth has been. The upper end of the wage scale, the jobs that pay the higher salaries are actually doing quite well. Those in kind of the middle wage have just now gotten back to normal, and the lower wage, as I said, the ones that always suffer, they're still below where they should be. So what can we expect in 2021? Well, this is what we should expect in January. We don't have the January numbers yet, employment numbers. We will get those in early March. But every January, we always see job losses. A couple of things are manifesting themselves here. One is, as I talked about, all the retail help, all the temporary help that was hired in September, October, November is let go after the Christmas holidays, whether it's retail or transportation or restaurants. You have restructuring plans that are finalized in the fall, but management says they don't want to lay anybody off at Thanksgiving or lay anybody off in the holidays, and those layoffs take place in January. Contract workers, which may have been brought on to hit a December 31st deadline, are let go. So we will see job losses in January. And when we see job losses in January, that pie is going to look a little bit more like this. And this is why I'm saying we're not going to recover all the jobs that we've lost this year. It's going to take us at least 2 years. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And if you kind of see the way the path it goes, this is, and you understand this is December of 2013. This was the drop off in January 14. And this was the last year of the fracking boom. And we got all the job losses back in 2 months. If you want to look at how it worked out when we were in the last year of the longest economic expansion in U.S. history, we got the jobs back around April or May. This January job losses in 2016, the height of the fracking bust, we never got them back. We finished up the year with a net job loss. So, if you take the average, which is this heavy green line, and if we simply grow at an average rate, we won't recoup our January losses until April. And that leaves us basically with 8 months of job growth. And that's how many jobs can we create in 8 months to make a dent in that 181,000 that we're going to have to still be dealing with. So Now, there are a few economic indicators I want to share with you. Dan, I know I'm going, and Bob, I know I'm going a little bit long, but let me go ahead and go through these real quick. Vehicle sales are down, not surprising. Part of it is the weakness in the economy. Part of it is people don't need to replace their vehicles as often because they're not driving as much. Home sales were up, hit a record. Part of it is low interest rates. Part of it is that chart I showed you earlier. Those who are in the upper end of the wage brackets, their jobs are more secure, or at least there are more jobs there than there were prior to the pandemic. So those are your prime home buyers. The rig count still, though, remains weak. It's lower than it was even at the worst part of the fracking bust. This is going to continue to affect oil field services, oil field equipment manufacturing, wholesale trade, which supplies the oil and gas industry, and exploration and production. Oil prices are up, as you can see in this chart right here. You think that, well, that's good, but Saudi Arabia has already announced that it's going to start letting some oil back onto the market to take advantage of that. So Saudi Arabia and OPEC Plus is going to benefit from the higher oil prices, probably more than we will. And construction contracts are down just a little bit. We are definitely overbuilt, and that's going to be something that weighs on the economy. But the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, the survey of the people out there who are looking at orders on the books and making sure there's enough stuff in the warehouse or in the supply closet to make sure that they can meet all the needs for the coming months. Whenever this dark blue line based on the survey is above the red line, that's a sign the economy is expanding. You can see how far we dropped during the height of the pandemic, and you can see we're back. So we're seeing some growth, just not as strong. So how long is it going to take to recover that 181,000 jobs? Well, if you look at the long-term annual average growth in the region, like over the last 30 years, we average about 66,000 jobs. So if all we do is grow on average, we're looking at about 2 years, 9 months to recoup all the jobs. And if you want to look at it on a monthly basis, 4,100 jobs, that would be 3 years, 8 months. If we do have really strong growth coming out of this, and we grow like we have in some of our boom times, and that is a possibility because there's a school of economists out there that think that we're going to have just a real boom in economic growth this year once the virus is contained and the stimulus packages are in place. We can recoup all the jobs in less than 2 years. But that's 2 years from today. That would be 3 years with employment below where it was prior to the pandemic. So what can we do? What can we do to open up the economy? What can we do as individuals? Well, the COVID virus is in the driver's seat. It's determining so much of what we do. So one thing you can do is you can avoid crowds. You can wear a mask to prevent the spread of the disease and not to pick up the virus and not to pick it up yourself. And the other is when you're eligible for a shot, go ahead and get it. And those are 3 things you can do to help open the economy. So thank you very much. I know I talked a little bit long. Hopefully I gave you guys some insights that you can use. And if you want to know anything about the partnership, we've got the easiest web address in the world to remember. That's www.houston.org. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will take questions if we have time for questions.
We have a number of questions, and let's go ahead and ask a couple of them as quick as we can. We got about 6 minutes left, and I will say that we will get you to answer the other questions via email, and we'll make sure our members get it at some point in the very next day or two. Okay, so real quickly, question number 1. Your research team seemingly tracks everything. What economic statistic or statistics will you be paying the most attention to over the next 6 months to gauge the progress of Houston's recovery? Can we track the same data points, and what should we look for?
Very easy. 2 data points. One is sales tax collections. Sales tax collections follow the business cycle. Not only do consumers pay a sales tax, but businesses pay a sales tax. If we see the sales tax collections trending up, that's a sign that not only are consumers spending, but businesses spending. And the other is the PMI.
Okay. Question 2. We are all hoping that this COVID downturn is fleeting. Has anything or any sector surprised you so far by having achieved a quicker than expected recovery story?
Business and professional services, finance and insurance, those are the white collar occupations. Those are the sort of things that can be done remotely. And those are high paying jobs. And so that's good for the economy on many, many fronts.
Okay, let's try two more real quick. In light of the fact that there has been so much stimulus from the U.S. government and Federal Reserve, what is your projection for the inflation by the end of the year? And if you can get this right, you'll go number one economist in the nation.
I will say inflation will be higher, but I'm not going to say how much. Now, I could see inflation kicking up. I don't see it kicking up significantly, but I can see it adding another percentage point to it, maybe a percentage and a half. But I really don't know. I can see it picking up, but not significantly.
Okay, Patrick. All right, let's try one more here. A new term is being coined, Texodus, because it seems that there's so many companies fleeing high-cost states like California and coming to Texas. Do you think this trend will continue, and what kinds of companies are leaving and coming to Texas?
Primary reason why a company picks up and relocates, well, there are multiple reasons. But one of them is it all comes down to the bottom line. They look at their spread, they look at their cost structure, they look at their workforce, they look at the business climate, and they try to find a place where they can be more profitable or not lose money. Texas fits the bill on many of those. We do have a low tax rate. We do have a well-trained workforce. We're going to have to overcome this perception that we have about energy. But I don't see any reason why we will not have companies continue to relocate. And even during the pandemic, when we were frozen, the partnership was still fielding calls from companies that were making inquiries about relocating to Houston.
Well, Patrick, I'll back you up on that because we were just as busy last year as any year we've been. I think we averaged about 31 projects throughout the year and actually landed some pretty good ones. And hopefully in the next few weeks, we'll have a couple more great announcements. So I certainly agree with you on that for sure. So Patrick, okay, we've run out of time. I want to thank you again. We really appreciate you taking time and addressing really three different areas when it comes to the economy. So thanks a lot. And I want to thank all of our members for participating in the meeting today. Thank you.